A contested land, a past of promises and a determined man. Oakwood Estate is more than a property. It is the symbol of a love that spans generations. John has a mission: to honor what was lost and to show that some stories are priceless. John adjusted his worn hat before stepping into the imposing glass office in the heart of the city. His dusty boots contrasted with the gleaming floor, and he could feel the curious glances of the employees as he hesitantly walked to the reception desk. The simple man from the countryside seemed out of place in that corporate environment. But his determined eyes revealed that he wouldn't leave without being heard. "Good morning, miss. I'd like to speak with someone about purchasing an estate," he said, his gentle voice carrying the distinctive accent of the countryside. The receptionist looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his worn clothes and calloused hands clutching a brown envelope. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, but something about the quiet dignity of the man made her pick up the phone. "Mr. Luke, there's a sir here interested in a rural property," she said, choosing her words carefully. After a brief pause, she gestured to John. "You can go up, 5th door on the right." The hallway seemed endless, each step echoing in the artificial silence of the air-conditioned environment. John took a deep breath, unconsciously touching the rosary in his shirt pocket, a gift from his mother that he always carried with him. Memories washed over him like a gentle wave, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee in the morning, the sound of birds at dawn, his mother humming as she watered the flowers at the estate. Luke was on the phone when John entered his office. The broker, wearing an impeccable suit and a gold watch on his wrist, made a casual gesture pointing to the chair in front of him. John sat down patiently, observing the dozens of framed certificates on the walls and the photos of luxurious properties on the glass table. "So how can I help you?" Luke finally asked, not hiding the boredom in his voice as he shuffled some papers on the table. "It's about Oakwood Estate," John replied, noticing how the name made Luke look up for the first time. "I heard it's for sale." A sly smile spread across the broker's lips. "Oakwood Estate? That 20-hectare property with the historic main house, a century-old orchard, and its own spring?" He laughed, leaning back in his chair. "My friend, I think there's been a mistake. That's one of the most sought-after properties in the area. We've got heavyweight investors interested." John remained calm, his eyes locked on the broker's. "There's no mistake. I came prepared to make an offer." "An offer?" Luke laughed again, louder this time. "Look, sir." "John," he completed calmly. "Mr. John, this property is valued at several million. No offense, but—" Luke gestured vaguely toward the visitor's simple attire. With calm movements, John opened the envelope he had brought with him and began laying out documents on the table. "I have here the proof of sale for my current property, savings from a lifetime, and a letter from the bank confirming the financing. I also brought something you might find interesting." Luke took the papers with evident disbelief, but his expression began to change as he reviewed the documents. John watched in silence, his rough hands resting on the last item he had yet to show, a yellowed, aged envelope. "Well, the numbers are surprising," admitted Luke, recomposing himself. "But I must warn you that there are other interested parties, a group of investors specifically with plans to turn the area into a luxury condominium. They have virtually unlimited resources." John nodded, as if he had already expected that information. "I understand. But money isn't everything. Mr. Luke, that estate, it means much more than you can imagine." "And what exactly does it mean to you?" asked Luke, a hint of genuine curiosity emerging in his voice. John fell silent for a moment, his eyes lost in distant memories. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "That estate was where I spent the best moments of my life, where my mother worked for years, taking care of the place as if it were her own, where I learned the value of the land and of people." Luke shifted uncomfortably, uneasy with the sudden change in atmosphere. Yes, very touching. But business is business. "The heirs are in dispute. There are substantial offers on the table." "The heirs?" John murmured, picking up the yellowed envelope. "Do you know their story well?" "Enough to make the deal," replied Luke impatiently. "Why?" John began to Carefully open the envelope, because some stories need to be told from the beginning to make sense. And this one started a long time ago, when my mother received something very special from the previous owners. Before he could continue, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. Luke's secretary hurried in. "I'm sorry, Mr. Luke, but the representative from the investors has arrived for the scheduled meeting." Luke quickly stood up, adjusting his tie. "I need to attend to this, Mr. John, but..." He hesitated, glancing at the envelope in the farmer's hands. "Perhaps we can continue this conversation another time." John carefully tucked the envelope away, rising slowly. "Of course, I'll be around in the coming days. There's a lot you need to know about that estate." As he walked toward the exit, John could feel Luke's intrigued gaze on his back. He smiled faintly. He knew he had planted a seed of curiosity in the broker. And curiosity, his mother always said, was the first step toward understanding. Outside, the afternoon sun touched the treetops, casting dancing shadows on the asphalt. John glanced in the direction where he knew Oakwood Estate lay, miles beyond the city buildings. His heart tightened with the familiarity of that distant landscape. He had taken the first step of his journey, but he knew the road ahead would be long. He touched the rosary in his pocket again, feeling the strength of memories and promises made so long ago. "I'll make it, Mom," he whispered to himself as he walked toward the bus stop. "You always said some lands have a soul, and this one has ours." If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Let us know which city you're watching from, and we'll continue. Luke couldn't sleep that night. The image of the farmer and the mysterious yellow envelope wouldn't leave his mind. Sitting in his home office with the illuminated city shining through the panoramic window of his apartment, he obsessively reviewed the documents John had left behind. The numbers were impressive for a man who seemed so simple, but there was something else there, something that deeply unsettled him. He picked up his tablet and began researching the history of Oakwood Estate. The official information was scarce. Built in the early 20th century, the property had belonged to one of the region's most traditional families, the Thompsons. The last matriarch, Mrs. Eleanor, was known for her kindness and for always keeping her doors open to anyone in need. After his passing, the property became a matter of dispute among the heirs. The phone rang, breaking his concentration. It was Frederick Thompson, the youngest of the heirs and the most interested in selling the property to the investors. "Luke, I need to know how today's meeting went." The voice on the other end sounded anxious. "Did the investors confirm the offer?" "Yes, Frederick, they kept the offer," Luke replied hesitantly, "but another interested party showed up today." "Another interested party?" Frederick laughed dismissively. Who would be crazy enough to compete with Horizon Developments? Luke drummed his fingers on the table, thoughtful. "A farmer. John, I don't remember the last name. He has an interesting history with the property. Apparently his mother worked there for years." "I don't care about any history," Frederick cut in sharply. "We need to close this deal quickly. The other heirs are causing problems, especially my Aunt Helen. She's been saying she promised something to Mrs. Eleanor before she passed." Luke straightened up in his chair, suddenly alert. "What kind of promise?" "Sentimental nonsense," Frederick brushed it off. "The important thing is that we already have a solid proposal. Let's not complicate things with stories from the past." After hanging up, Luke remained thoughtful. He opened his planner and searched for Helen Thompson's contact. She was the only heir who had not yet agreed to the sale, remaining strangely silent throughout the entire process. The next morning, Luke drove to Helen's house, a modest building on the outskirts of the city. He found the 70-year-old woman tending to her garden, as if the weight of family decisions did not affect her. "Mrs. Helen," he called, approaching. "Sorry for coming unannounced." She looked up from the flower bed, a serene smile on her time-worn face. "Ah, the broker. I was expecting your visit. Come in, I'll make some coffee." In the cozy kitchen, Helen served coffee in antique porcelain cups. "So, what brings the representative of big business to my humble home?" "Mrs. Helen, I need to understand your position on the sale of the estate." Luke got straight to the point. The other heirs have already agreed the offer is more than generous. Money, she sighed, looking out the window. You know, young man, some things are priceless. My sister Eleanor understood that perfectly. Frederick mentioned something. About a promise. Helen fell silent for a moment, her eyes welling up with held-back tears. Eleanor was different from the rest of us. She saw beyond appearances, beyond money. In recent years, she had a very special employee, Emily. Luke felt his heart race. Emily? Yes, an extraordinary woman who took care of the estate with as much love as my sister. Her son, a boy at the time, practically grew up there. Helen paused, carefully observing Luke's reaction. But that was a long time ago. Why the sudden interest in old stories? Luke hesitated but decided to share. Yesterday, a man named John showed up at my office, interested in buying the estate. He mentioned that his mother worked there. Helen stood up abruptly, her hands trembling slightly. He walked over to an old piece of furniture in the room and opened a drawer. By any chance, did he show any old documents? A yellowed envelope, perhaps? He had one, but he didn't get to show the contents. How do you know about that? Because I was there when Eleanor wrote that letter, replied Helen, her voice heavy with emotion. It was just a few days before she left us. She made everyone promise that the estate would be preserved, that it would continue to be a place of refuge. And what did the letter say? That, Helen smiled mysteriously, is something only the recipient should reveal. But I can say that my sister had her reasons to trust Emily and her son so much. Luke left Helen's house with more questions than answers. On his way back to the office, he drove past the road leading to Oakwood Estate. He pulled over to the side and gazed at the towering oak trees that gave the property its name, their majestic crowns standing out against the blue sky. His phone rang again. It was the investor's representative pressing for a decision on the sale. Luke took one last look at the estate before answering. For the first time in his career, the value of a property couldn't be measured solely in numbers. On the other side of town, John was sitting at the table in his small house, the yellowed envelope open in front of him. His hands gently caressed an old photograph where his mother, very young, smiled next to an elegant lady, Mrs. Eleanor. On the back of the photo, a faded inscription held a secret that could change everything. A car parked in front of his house. John carefully put the photo and the letter back into the envelope as he watched a familiar figure step out of the vehicle through the window. Helen Thompson had come to visit him, carrying with her the weight of decades of history and untold secrets. Helen crossed the small garden of John's house with slow steps, observing the well-kept flower beds that so closely resembled the ones Emily used to maintain at the estate. Her eyes scanned the modest structure, noticing the flower pots in the windows and the scent of fresh coffee in the air, the same details her sister Eleanor had so admired in her former employee. John opened the door before she even knocked. Their eyes met in a moment of mutual recognition, decades of untold stories hanging between them. "Mrs. Helen," he said softly, "I was expecting your visit." "You look so much like her," Helen murmured, her eyes welling up. "You have the same gentle gaze as Emily." Sitting at the kitchen table, the yellowed envelope between them, John poured coffee into the only porcelain cups he owned, a gift from his mother. Helen recognized them immediately. Eleanor gave these cups to Emily on the last Christmas. "We all spent together at the estate," she remarked, running her fingers along the delicate rim of the cup. "You must have been very young." "I was 5, John confirmed, his eyes lost in memories. "I remember the smell of the cookies Mrs. Eleanor used to make, the sound of the stream at the back of the property, the stories she told under the ancient oak tree." Helen took a deep breath, gathering courage. "John, we need to talk about the letter. Luke came to see me today, and Frederick is pushing to close the deal with the investors." John nodded, carefully opening the envelope. Besides the letter, there was the photo he had been looking at earlier and some old documents. He laid everything out on the table with reverence. "Your sister was an extraordinary woman, Mrs. Helen," he began. "My mother always said that Mrs. Eleanor could see into people's hearts. She was the one who took us in when we had nothing and no one." Helen picked up the photograph, her hands trembling slightly. I remember the day this photo was taken. It was Eleanor's birthday, and Emily had prepared a surprise party. It was the first time I saw my sister cry tears of joy. John took the letter out of the envelope, the aged paper carefully preserved. My mother kept this letter as her most treasured possession. She only told me about its contents at the end of her life, making me promise to fight for what was right. And what did the letter say, John? He began to read aloud. Dear Emily, my faithful friend and companion of so many years, as I write these words, I know my time is nearing its end, but there are truths that must be preserved. Eleanor's words, written with the elegance of a bygone era, revealed a story of love, loyalty, and secrets kept for decades. The letter spoke of a promise made between the two women, of an agreement sealed with tears, and of a bond far deeper than that of employer and employee. Helen covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. So it's true. All these years? Eleanor never told us. John waited patiently for her to compose herself. Do you understand now why this land means so much to me? It's not just a piece of ground or a valuable property. It's the place where two families became one. But Frederick, the other heirs, they don't know, and that's why I need your help, Mrs. Helen. John leaned forward, his voice steady. We can't let the estate be turned into a luxury condominium. Mrs. Eleanor had other plans for that place. Helen wiped away her tears, a new determination emerging on her face. The other documents, do they prove it? John nodded, carefully, sorting through the papers. It's all here, the records, the old deeds, even my mother's first employment contract, but the most important thing. He paused, pulling out one last document from the envelope, is this. The paper, yellowed with age but still perfectly legible, made Helen hold her breath. It was an official document, signed and notarized, dated just a few days before Eleanor's passing. My God, whispered Helen, her hands trembling as she held the document. This changes everything. At that moment, they were interrupted by insistent knocks at the door. John stood up cautiously and opened it a crack. Luke was standing on the threshold, his impeccable suit contrasting with the simple surroundings. Sorry to intrude, said the broker, his gaze shifting between John and Helen. But we need to talk. The investors are pressing for an answer, and Frederick is threatening to take legal action. Helen stood up, holding firmly the document she had just read. Come in, Luke. It's time for you to learn the true story of Oakwood Estate. Luke sat down with them at the table, observing the scattered documents with growing interest. John began to tell the story from the beginning, each word revealing layers of a long-hidden truth. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. A gentle breeze swayed the curtains by the window, carrying the scent of flowers from the garden. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, as if marking the moment. When the past and present finally met, Helen held John's hand across the table, a gesture that carried the weight of generations. Eleanor always said that the truth has its own time to bloom, she murmured, like the oaks at the estate. Luke looked at the documents before him, his worldview shifting with each new revelation. The ambitious broker who had mocked John days before was beginning to understand that some stories could not be measured in numbers or contracts. Luke's office was packed the next morning. Frederick had called an emergency meeting with all the heirs after learning that Helen was contesting the sale. The representative from Horizon Developments, Mr. Johnson, was also present, his impatient expression revealing his discomfort with the delay in negotiations. John remained silent, seated beside Helen. The yellowed envelope rested on her lap as Luke arranged the documents on his desk with a care that surprised everyone who knew him. This is absurd. Frederick slammed his hand on the table, his voice echoing through the room. We can't let a farmer interfere in a deal of this magnitude. Frederick, Helen said softly, there are things about the estate and your aunt, Helena, that you need to know. What could be more important than $15 million, he replied, exasperated. John opened the envelope and pulled out the document he had shown Helen and Luke the day before. Perhaps this will answer your question, he said, handing the paper to Frederick. The silence that followed was deafening. Frederick read and reread the document. his face shifting through various shades. The other heirs approached, curious. This can't be true," Frederick stammered. Luke stood up, his voice taking on a professional tone that now carried a new dimension of humanity. "The document is legitimate. We've done all the necessary checks. It's an additional will from Mrs. Eleanor, registered just a week before her passing." "But why did she never tell us?" asked one of the nieces, tears in her eyes. Helen picked up the old photograph and passed it around among the family. Eleanor and Emily shared more than a working relationship. When Emily arrived at the estate, pregnant and alone, Eleanor didn't just take her in. She found in the young woman the daughter she never had. And in her son the grandson she always dreamed of, Luke added, gesturing respectfully toward John. The will revealed that Eleanor had legally recognized Emily as her adopted daughter, making John her rightful grandson. More than that, she had established specific conditions for the property. The estate was to remain a place of refuge, a sanctuary for people who, like Emily once did, needed a second chance. "But the investors," Frederick began, only to be interrupted by Mr. Johnson. "I'm afraid we'll have to withdraw our proposal," the executive said, standing up. "Complex family matters like this usually result in lengthy and costly legal battles. It's not in the best interest of our shareholders." When Mr. Johnson left the room, silence returned. John finally stood up, his calm voice filling the space. "I didn't come here to cause division in the family," he said. "What I propose is to honor Mrs. Eleanor's wish. Yes, I am in a position to buy your share of the property, but my true proposal is different." John then revealed his plan to transform the Oakwood estate into a foundation jointly managed by the family. A place that would combine environmental preservation with social programs, offering temporary housing and professional training for families in vulnerable situations. "My mother and Mrs. Eleanor shared this dream," he explained, emotional. "The estate has fertile land, infrastructure, and most importantly, a history of hospitality. We can turn it into something even more special." Helen was the first to speak up. Eleanor would be proud. This is exactly the kind of legacy she would want to leave. One by one, the heirs began to agree. Even Frederick, after a long moment of reflection, nodded. "You're right. Selling to a luxury condominium, that's not what Aunt Eleanor would have wanted." Luke observed the scene with a subtle smile. In his career as a realtor, he had closed hundreds of profitable deals, but he had never witnessed anything like this, a moment where the value of a property was measured not in money, but in its potential for transformation. 3 months later, the Oakwood Foundation opened its doors. The old mansion had been restored, respecting its historic architecture. The orchards were revitalized, new flower beds were planted, and the first families began to arrive. On a golden autumn afternoon, John walked through the gardens beside Helen. They stopped under the century-old oak tree, where a new bench had been installed. A discreet plaque bore an inscription, "In memory of Eleanor and Emily, mothers who taught us that family is whom the heart chooses." Luke, who was now part of the Foundation's administrative board, approached with a smile. "I just received 3 more requests for shelter. The news about the work we're doing here is spreading." John looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. The scent of flowers filled the air, mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee coming from the community kitchen. From somewhere nearby, the laughter of playing children could be heard. "You know," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "my mother always said that some lands have a soul. But now I understand it's not the land itself. It's what we do with it, how we turn a space into a home." Helen squeezed his hand affectionately. "And now Oakwood Estate will be home to many other Emilys and their Johns." The bell from the old chapel rang in the distance, its melody carried by the evening breeze. It was the same bell that had witnessed so many stories over the decades, and now it heralded a new chapter, not just for the estate, but for all who would find shelter beneath its ancient trees. Dear listeners, we hope the story of John Oakwood Estate and the transformative power of family love has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of emotions and inspiring stories, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Daily, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the power of true love. Share your own family and overcoming stories in the comments. We'd love to hear them. Don't miss our upcoming content. The next story might be even more special.